This is the Hour of History podcast. Our world, anytime, anyplace. And now from the Hour of History studio in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, your Hour of History starts right now.
Hello and welcome to Hour of History. I'm your host, Stephen Bauman, and this is a special episode coming to you from Hour of History studios in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Now, this is being pre-recorded before I travel to Cuba to present this paper at the Canadian Anthropology Society Cuba Conference in Santiago. I wanted to record some podcasts so the stream could continue while I was away, and one of the things I wanted to do was present the same sort of argument and paper that I'm going to be making at this anthropology convention. So, I'm going to share something a little more specific than we usually talk about on Hour of History, and hopefully you can see some of the other things that I'm looking into with my research outside of just the regular podcast. Now, a couple things to keep in mind. A lot of this research is unfinished. Even though I've been working on this project for the better part of a year, I still have a long way to go, and I still have a large plan for the research growing. And maybe in a future podcast we can talk about research and what it means to be a historian and to continually be refining the research and looking into new paths of this sort of uncharted territory, in a lot of ways, uncharted paths. Now, one of the reasons I'm presenting for and to the Anthropology Society instead of just a regular history conference is because I came across a problem on the project that I researched. And the problem was, in the written record, I could only find very little of the voice of the Cuban people. So I turned to anthropologists and I turned to some of the theories and the terms and the ideas that anthropologists have come up in order to sort of unearth voices that have previously not been in the record. So, without anything further, I'd like you to please keep in mind that this is unfinished and to not cite or refer this in any paper, as it's not yet a completed work. This paper is called The Finca Paso Seco: Unearthing Cuban Voices at an American Quaker Farm for European Jewish Refugees in Cuba, 1939 to 1941. And my goal in this was to find the voices from the Finca Paso Seco, an American work camp created for Jewish European refugees in Cuba at the onset of World War II, and articulate a cultural crossroads. So this is where cultures are interacting. Here at the Finca, a farm, Americanization, religious and linguistic plurality, and a basic survival all existed at the Finca. The Finca was imagined by Dr. Herta Kraus, a German-born sociology professor in Pennsylvania and consultant for the American Friends Service Committee. It was a place of transformation for Jewish refugees, American aid workers, and Cubans. Yet, while multiple distinct cultures intersected at the farm, Cuba serves as little more than a setting for the numerous documents written both by American humanitarians and European refugees. My goal here is to not only highlight the project of Americanization that was happening at the Finca Paso Seco, in order to sort of shed light on why all these excellent written records, from the American aid workers to the Jewish refugees, and we don't see anything about Cubans, even though this farm was in Cuba. So this mission of assimilation that was carried out by the American Friends Service Committee in order to get these Jewish refugees safely to the United States sort of relied on the American position that they had in Cuba. It relied on the American power that existed in Cuba before the revolution, and the way in which Americans could go and set up projects without necessarily having complete or total control. So, what is the Finca Paso Seco? The refugee crisis that sort of prompted this farm to grew out of political instability in Germany in the 1930s. The Nazi persecution of the Jews was widespread by the late 1930s. In seeking racial purity, the German Nazi Party aimed at eliminating the small minority of Jews from the German population. To remove the Jews from Germany, Nazi politicians played off international anti-Semitism and put extreme pressure on the world to take millions of German Jews. The Nazi Party demonized the Jewish population through the 1930s, and the terror crescendoed to violence in November 1938. The violence, known as Kristallnacht, or Night of the Broken Glass, was marked by widespread German attacks on Jewish shops, synagogue burnings, and burglaries of Jewish homes. Jews able to leave Germany sought refuge in other nations shortly after Kristallnacht. In 1938 and 1939, the refugee crisis gained worldwide attention. President Franklin Roosevelt called for a meeting to address the crisis. It was called the Avion Conference. Representatives from all over the world met and failed to offer an adequate solution. The conference resulted in a failure in which both Cuba and the United States, among other nations, refused to take more refugees. An interesting note of this conference is the Dominican Republic, led by General Rafael Trujillo, actually offered to take 100,000 Jews as part of Trujillo's wider whitening the Dominican Republic project, because he saw these Jews, which in many cases they were Germans, as being whiter than his population, so they were going to be good. So Trujillo is one of the outliers in this conference, and his legacy continues to be mixed today about the conference. But in terms of Cuba, the United States, and even European nations, very few agreed to take more refugees, which really bolstered the sort of Nazi propaganda machine saying, well, no one really wants to take these refugees. Many Americans wanted to preserve American resources for America. They wanted Americans to be able to use it first, and they didn't want anyone who might challenge American culture to come to America. And this was same in many nations that attended the Avion Conference. Some people wouldn't even accept the invitation. Even efforts in the United States like the Wagner-Rogers Bill, which aimed to allow 20,000 German refugee children, in addition to the regular quota that the United States immigration operated on, failed to become law due to nativist nationalism, just to this America for Americans idea. The lackluster government response led to the infamous rejection of the ship, the MS St. Louis. In June 1939, Cuba, the United States, and Canada, in this MS St. Louis disaster, rejected hundreds of refugees, over 900, in what historians now popularly call the Voyage of the Damned. What happened was the MS St. Louis departed Hamburg with over 900 Jewish German refugees who hoped to disembark safely in Cuba. Part of the deal at the time was if they gave a $500 bond to the Cuban government, they would be allowed to enter Cuba under a tourist visa where they could wait until they could get approval to enter the United States. But somewhere along the sea, word spread, and the Cuban government decided it wasn't going to take those people on the MS St. Louis. And after circling back and forth between Havana and Miami, appealing to the governments of the United States, Cuba, and Canada, the St. Louis was sent back to Europe with nearly all of the same passengers. One man committed suicide off the coast, off the shore of Havana, not willing to go back to Europe and to face imminent doom. Failures like the Avion Conference and the Voyage of the Damned inspired the American Friends Service Committee to create a refugee committee and to help the Jewish refugees, which was kind of extraordinary for the time, being that mostly it was Jewish organizations that were helping Jewish refugees at that time. So who were the American Friends Service Committee? Founded in 1917, the American Friends Service Committee embodied a peaceful response to the growing conflict of the First World War. Conscientious objectors created the AFSC, the American Friends Service Committee, to help people who suffered and non-violently serve their nation. So this grew out of the effort of the peace churches to be patriotic at a time of war without holding weapons or fighting. Although Friends, informally known as Quakers, founded the organization, they did not limit its goal of global peace to only friends in need. Historical literature on the actions of the AFSC remains pretty sparse, despite the organization's 1947 Nobel Peace Prize and just recent 100-year record of humanitarian service. One way the AFSC responded to suffering was through refugee relief. So they formed this refugee committee, which decided to create places of transition to accommodate refugees unable to enter the United States under the quota system. While the refugees waited, the goal was that volunteers would teach them English, American customs, and American history. So they were following contemporary sociology, which at the time taught that Americanization was both the best for refugees and the United States. With over 700 case files in 1939, the AFSC searched globally to find locations to host refugees. They looked at things like farms in Bolivia, wilderness in Alaska. They were looking for any option to get people new locations to live in. Exploiting the deep roots laid by the American economic and political influences in Cuba, the AFSC leased the Finca Paso Seco, which was a farm estate 15 kilometers south of Havana. It had 27 rooms, 5 bathrooms, and plenty of land for farming, despite its name, which means the dry path farm. Water did end up being a problem for them. It was also a good distance from the vices of the city, which was something the Quakers consciously wanted to avoid. They were able to fund this project largely in collaboration with the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, the JDC, an organization that was at the time just overwhelmed with the influx of Jewish refugees. So it was welcome assistance. To lead the camp, the AFSC chose Amigo Li to control daily operations. He was a 6'6" farmer turned professor from Nebraska who had a humanitarian experience in Mexico and Spain. Goli's goal was to transform this middle-class European refugee into a farmer that might find new life in the United States. Farmers were sometimes granted exceptions under the quota system because they were seen as vital to the United States economy. One example of this is Willie Kish, a refugee at the Finca who was only 24 years old when he arrived at Cuba. Unlike other refugees, Kish actually writes about Cuba in his letters. He, draws parallels between Cuban politicians and Weimar Republic Germany. He's skeptical about sort of the promises that they're given in coming to America, but he's ultimately hopeful and entirely involved in the Jewish community in Cuba. He also and other refugees give us an insight into the day-to-day operations of this refugee camp, this finca. Refugees received psychotherapy in order to help them face the fear, loss of faith, irritability, and other challenges. Volunteers taught English to the refugees with works focusing on authors like Robert Louis Stevenson and Pearl Buck. To study history, they were taught American documents like the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and they published their own newsletter to practice both the trade of printing and English language. They had optional mornings to meet for worship, and they had music nights led by some of the talented musicians who themselves were also refugees. And some of these nights were rather big nights that the American community in Havana took as sort of an escape from the city and donated to the cause. The goals were to provide an environment in which to conserve the physical and mental health of a very select group of refugees. These are the words of one of the AFSC volunteers himself. Provide an education program that will assist the prospect of an immigrant making a successful adjustment to the United States. They wanted to change these people into Americans, basically, and it didn't go exactly as imagined. In fact, one Quaker writes, "The program of Americanization has been difficult by the fact it has to exist in a foreign environment. To try to teach a Central European something of ways of American life with which he has had no contact, in a Spanish cultural environment with which he is constantly in contact, is a double handicap. We should really focus on Spain, France, and Europe." And these were just some of the frustrations in this project that had originally held so much potential for them. So what were the Cubans thinking? If this was a so-called Spanish cultural environment like the AFSC had, what was the sort of temperature of the Cuban community in Havana? Well, the AFSC called to unite the Jewish communities in Havana because there was already a decent population of Jews in Cuba. Yet, they were unable to really bring any sort of coherent response together. The U.S. government changed the quota numbers for Cubans and therefore made it harder for refugees to get into the United States. They lowered the numbers under the Cuban quota system, which some of these refugees were able to use up.
You've reached the halfway point of this week's Hour of History podcast. Just wanted to remind you all to support us by subscribing and sending us your likes and comments at hourofhistory.com or on our YouTube channel. We want to thank you again for listening, and now the second half of this week's Hour of History podcast.
They also, under Cuban law, were not allowed to work, but they were allowed to open their own business. So some of the wealthier Jews that were coming from Europe were allowed to open things like diamond shops. So if they came with diamonds from Belgium, and this happened, they were allowed to come to Cuba and open a diamond business. And this happens, and stores opened in Havana. Now, on the other side of this, if they came and they were not wealthy and they did not have any sort of capital with them, then they were not allowed to work. And so that left a sort of problem. So the JDC, the Jewish Distribution Committee, supported a lot of these people in Havana, and the AFSC helped them to do that. Now, in Havana, the Jewish population already had about 20,000 Jews, mostly of Eastern European descent, who had themselves been refugees in the 1920s, but from countries like Russia and Poland. So there was already a cultural difference. While the world was categorizing these Jews as all the same, oh, they're all Jewish, they spoke different languages, they came from different Jewish traditions, so there wasn't so much in common. Not to mention, the 1920s refugees from Eastern Europe were already largely adapted to Cuban culture. Some of them had abandoned any sort of Jewish identity they had already and had adopted entirely Cuban sort of view of the world. Now, many anti-Semitic voices started to arise in Cuba, and that's been written about quite a lot. But what people haven't really written about is this newspaper, Noticias de Hoy, who defends refugees. It was a communist newspaper that had been illegal up until the mid-1930s, but eventually it's allowed to be published again, and it mentions the struggle of the refugees on multiple occasions. So in mid-November, you have strong mentions of the Kristallnacht that I talked about before. It's called an atrocious slaughter of Jews. The pro-refugee writing continues. There's organizations that are allowed to advertise in this newspaper and promote group meetings to sort of combat anti-Semitism in Havana, meeting at Centro Israelita in Havana Cuban Jewish Community Center. So there were efforts. In fact, the famed anthropologist from Havana, Fernando Ortiz, publishes his Defensa Cubana contra el racismo antisemita immediately after the MS St. Louis disaster. And he's explaining basically sort of a constitution for this association, Asociación Nacional contra las Discriminaciones Racistas, an organization that he's president of. He is a president of an organization that is attempting to weed out racism, founded in 1937 in Havana. And in his address, he's clearly trying to make sense of a nation of immigrants rejecting Jewish refugees. He argues that not only have there been Jews in Cuba since the Spanish first arrived in Cuba, so Jews, were kicked out of Spain back in the 15th century, and a lot of them came to Cuba, but also Cuba had Jamaicans, Haitians, and Galician immigrants from Asturias, all over Spain. So Cuban culture, and this becomes a sort of key of Fernando Ortiz's anthropological arguments, is a place of transculturation. So culture in Cuba is constantly being mix. A little bit of the Spanish culture is mixing with a little bit of the Haitian culture, is mixing with a little bit of the Jamaican culture. There's no dominant sort of force in this Cuban culture. They're all exchanging cultural ideas. So this is Ortiz's argument, rather than acculturation, which is the sort of thing that's happening at the Finca, where the AFSC is giving these refugees a set of ideas, not necessarily saying, you tell us what you do and then we'll learn your ideas too. They're just saying, this is how to be an American and you should do that. So these sort of ideas continue. There's an entire book called For Truth and Justice about the Jewish refugee problem, that to dispel notions of anti-Semitism. And this book was actually written in collaboration between an American rabbi and a Cuban professor. And what it is really a response in detail to Juan Projas, who was the founder of the Cuban Nazi Party, a newspaper editor and publisher of anti-Semitic materials. And so these arguments were going back and forth. And so while newspapers that were read frequently in the wealthier quarters, like La Mañana, La Voz, El País Libre, Diario La Mariña, things like that, were, sort of anti-immigration, talking about Cuba should not be accepting these Jewish immigrants, while Noticias de Hoy was calling for the acceptance of Jewish refugees. Radio was also central to Cuban life in the 1930s and 1940s, and there were certainly appeals to keep admitting Jewish refugees through this medium. So there were a lot of discussions going on, and so there's a good chance, and this is research that I'm going to continue to carry out while I'm in Havana, there's a good chance that there was a strong contingent of people who was willing to work with Jewish refugees and who were not anti-refugee at all. In fact, they were probably, as you might expect, the Cuban people to be, welcoming and warm and hopeful for these sort of Jewish refugees. One of the things of the original Jewish immigrant groups from the 1920s is that they did not stay in Havana. It was not like there was no Jewish neighborhood, things like that. What happened is there's a rapid dispersal, and many of them just adopt Cuban culture almost entirely in the 1920s, which was one of the reasons the AFSC sort of struggled with bringing together a sort of united Cuban response to this Jewish refugee crisis. So there's a change that happens in Cuban politics and Cuban government as well as in world politics. So the Cubans get a new constitution in 1940. Fulgencio Batista is elected to power. He becomes president of Cuba, and the Jewish population of Europe is basically cut off from leaving Europe as the 1941 begins, 1940, the fewer and fewer are able to get out. So there becomes less need. Although there were 6,000 Cubans in Havana in the late 1930s, early 1940s, refugees, the doors essentially become closed because fewer and fewer come, and the Cubans start focusing on refugees from the Spanish Civil War. So especially ideologically aligned refugees like the communists who are not going to survive under Francisco Franco's dictatorship in Spain. So in 1941, the AFSC took the advice of its workers, and it decided to close the Finca and to leave Cuba and go and focus on relief efforts in Europe, focus on relief efforts in the United States, and try to sort of minimize any problems they have with this issue of working in a foreign land, which, has its own irony because they chose this foreign land to work in. So we have this here, a story of refugees, a story of a humanitarian effort, and a story of Cuban people who just happen to have their island available to sort of American use for American projects. What it is an interesting place in which numerous cultures are interacting, and where we can sort of talk about how these events, these refugee crises in the world, sort of start to change perspectives on people across boundaries. Now, the Jewish community survived in Cuba. Some didn't make it to the United States. Some did immigrate eventually to the United States and looked fondly back on their time in Cuba and their time at the Finca. Others stayed in Cuba and adopted and joined the Cuban culture. So when I'm in Cuba and when I'm doing research, I'm going to be visiting some of these locations. I'll go to the Finca, which was changed after the revolution from this farm estate into a public park. It's now Lenin Park, right across from the Havana Zoo. I'm going to check the Centro Israelita and the Jewish communities that still exist in Havana. There's a Holocaust museum there that sort of recounts this really famous MS St. Louis event. I'm going to meet with and talk to Quakers that are still in Cuba and the Society of Friends. I'm going to look at some of the locations where these things happened, where the first AFSC meetings took place, just around the corner from where Ernest Hemingway used to sip daiquiris in Old Havana. So I'm going to continue to look at this project, and I'm going to continue to consider the ramifications it has for eras in which we look at refugees with the same sort of skepticism that the Jewish refugees from Central Europe were looked at in the 1930s. I want to continue to do research on how the government reacted or failed to react to these events, and how organizations like the American Friends Service Committee and the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee worked together and paid close attention to publications like Noticias de Hoy, which sought to, dispel some of these notions that people had. Today we live in sort of a frenetic age where on Twitter you can basically get any opinion that you want, but in a lot of ways it's not so different from the 1930s, 1940s, when you could turn on radio stations and broadcasts that were ideologically aligned to you. It was possible back then to pick up a newspaper that was anti-Semitic if that was what you wanted in Cuba. It was possible to pick up a newspaper that was pro-immigration and pro-refugee. And that sort of idea continues today. But what I want to continue to get at the heart of is how these people interacted and what these interactions meant in the long term for their lives and for the lives of people around them. How did the world of Cuba and the world of the university that Amigo Li taught at, how did these worlds change based on their interactions and based on their experiences? I have a feeling I'm going to find something like what Fernando Ortiz describes as transculturation, in which people are constantly sharing ideas and taking from each other on both directions and learning and growing with each other. I'm not certain if I will find that, but I'm certainly excited to look for it. And I hope you'll continue to listen to Hour of History podcast and continue to participate with me on this search for reactions in the past of these global humanitarian efforts that not only impacted those who were in need of humanitarian aid, but those who lived around them. So thank you for listening. Thank you for joining Hour of History, and feel free to email or tweet any questions to me. On Hour of History, it's our world, anytime, any place.